Okay, would you believe me if I told you that there is one tip that I can give you? It is my absolute favorite tip to give everybody in workshops that I teach that will help you figure out and learn to paint anything. Yes, anything. And no, I'm not exaggerating. I know that sounds like a really big promise, and it is, but being a self-taught artist and figuring out how to paint things, I discovered one tiny little tip that I'm gonna share with you today so that you can go forward and not feel intimidated by even the most complex frilly flower, whatever that it is that you're wanting to paint. So let's go. All right, so as promised, I'm gonna show you my number one trick that I figured out and taught myself, which might be obvious, but as a self-taught artist, it wasn't, for painting anything. So let's look at this painting that I created a while ago, and it is a crocus. And as a new artist, I may have found crocuses really difficult. In fact, I did. Sometimes I still do, honestly. But the number one thing that I have discovered is that in order to paint or draw anything, you really just need to break it down to its most fundamental thing, which is its shape, both generally speaking, and the shapes that make up the bigger shape and their relationships to each other. If you can understand the shape of something and what makes it up, you can draw or paint anything. So let's take some examples here. I have my iPad with just a few photos that I found with some things that might be potentially tricky for people to paint or draw. So we're gonna focus mostly on drawing, because you can do the same thing with painting. So let's say I got all of these photos from unsplash.com. It's an open source website for photographers to share their work and for creatives to use their work. So go check it out. This is not an ad. I just really like making sure I'm not infringing on anybody's copyright. So let's say we're drawing a house, right? We can look at the general shape of the house and try to start figuring out perspectives and all of that stuff. And of course that is genuinely important, but when you're drawing, your style might be a little bit wonky, and maybe you don't want it to look exactly like this. Maybe you have a distorted perspective in your style, whatever it is. But when we're looking at our object that we're drawing, we start to break it down into the smaller shapes. For us, we first need to see the general shape that we're creating, and then we need to break down the smaller shapes. So we have this wider rectangle, this rectangle or square with a triangle on top, along with a longer rectangle and another long rectangle, and then squares and more rectangles. Obviously, this is mostly squares and rectangles, and triangles, but you can kind of see what I'm getting at there in terms of drawing. We can also then start looking at something like this pen, where maybe we want to draw a pen, but it's a beautiful ornate pen. And how do I start drawing that? It's essentially looking at, of course it's cut off here, but so we have a cylinder on one end here that is connected to a smaller cylinder that kind of tapers. That is connected to another cylinder that is then connected to this thing, right? So what is this thing made up of? We can say it's made up of first kind of a rectangle, followed by a triangle. And then once we have the basic shapes down, we can come in and start refining it, right? To make sure that everything that we're actually creating within those shapes starts to become more refined as we start to get into more of those details. Like this kind of has a curved corner and a curved corner to it on this side. This square, obviously, there's no line actually there. We can start to draw the details within our pen and so on and so forth. And we have taken all of these different shapes and just kind of pieced it together. Now you're probably here because you know that I like to do a lot of florals. So let's start looking at something like a peony. One of the most intimidating flowers I think I've ever drawn, that and chrysanthemum. But something I figured out when I first started drawing them is that they are made up of shapes and the shapes' relationships to each other. So I can look at the general, shape of the outline of this peony and generally where the center of the peony is. But when I get down to drawing the nitty and gritty of it, I'm going to come down to the middle, the very center of whatever I'm drawing, and I'm going to pick, one of these petals. Let's take this one. And I am just in relation to this center, which I will generally, if it's really detailed, I'm going to come in later and add all that detail, but I'll give myself a general idea of where that center is going to be so that I know I'm not just painting an egg. I'm going to come in and see how this is shaped and its relationship to the center, right? And from here, what are the relationships that it has with all the other shapes around it? So for instance, this guy is going to be coming down, hugs along the center, and comes up here. So you can go in and start creating all these different shapes. When you have a curve in your petal, like with this one, it's just two shapes together. So the curve meets where these two petals meet. So it's kind of like a wonky triangle with a bit of a rectangle or another triangle underneath it. And then as you start to develop it, you go in and start to add some detail, make the lines a little more curved, and you just build your paintings out one by one. And before you know it, you're able to paint anything. One of the peonies that I ended up drawing ended up being the cover of my book, which was fun. I have a bigger picture of it in here. So let's take a look. Right, so we have this beautiful peony cluster with 5 different peonies, and they're all in different angles. And essentially, you're just coming up with all these different shapes and their relationships to each other. And how does that really work to equal the end result that you're looking for? When you look at different roses, again, you're just looking at the shapes. Because if you're creating something like this wild rose, the shape of this petal and their relationship to each other, the shape of the leaves and their relationship to each other are going to be very different from the next flower or the next tree or the next object. And it's those shapes and the relationships that make up what you're actually drawing, right? So you know at the end of the day what you can create. So the end result of this shape of petal in relation to its center and these shapes of leaves in relation to the stem and to the flower make an anemone, as opposed to the poppy, which has very different shapes, very different feel to it. And there you go. Now you can go out and draw anything. Hey guys, it's me again, Isa. If you liked this tutorial, make sure you subscribe to my channel and leave a comment. Tell me something you loved about the class. Feel free to ask me some questions, but definitely subscribe to my channel so you don't miss any future tutorials. See you next time.